Perfect. So welcome everybody. Today we are going to discuss electric vehicles and equity. And if you haven't had the chance to yet, please use the chat function on your toolbar to enter in your name, pronouns, organization, and why you chose to join us today. And then we can go ahead and get started with some housekeeping rules for those who are new to Zoom. Okay, so you should see a toolbar and you'll have three different functions. There is the chat function. And if you click that, it will open up the chat box. We encourage you to use this today because we want to have some discussions as well as hear from our presenters. There's also the Q&A function. Please use this if you have a specific question you want to ask one of our panelists. And then lastly, we have the raise hand function. So this will be used during specific times where if you want to voice your opinion or voice a question during those designated times, please use that and then we will be able to unmute you. Okay, and my name is Amy Maxey, for those who don't know. I am a program manager with Northern Colorado Clean Cities, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of equity as well as highlight a couple equity involved EV plans, or EV plans that involve equity, pardon me. But first, let's start off with some definitions. Some people, I feel like, interchange the word equality and equity, but really there are some key differences. So equality aims to promote fairness. So for instance, where everyone gets the same amount of resources, but this is really only effective if all participants have similar starting points and similar access to those resources in the future. So this approach can really disregard the needs of others. But equity, on the other hand, takes into account the individual's needs. So it accounts for identities such as race, ethnicity, gender, and others. And it also takes into account circumstances that may hinder the success of one participant over another. And we found this great quote too that I think sums it up pretty well. It says, from Paula Dressel, it says, "The route to achieving equity will not be accomplished through treating everyone equally. It will be achieved by treating everyone justly according to their circumstances." So think about that as we move forward in this webinar, because those are kind of key sorts of definitions for us to use while thinking about equity in EVs. And now there are also different barriers and benefits when it comes to EVs and equity. Some benefits is that it decreases air pollution. EVs have, well, fully electric EVs have zero tailpipe emissions and lower life cycle emissions than conventional vehicles. They also can help address environmental justice, boost our regional and local economies. And once you have your EV, there are lower costs associated with it. So your fueling costs or your charging costs are cheaper than filling up at the gas pump. And they're also more stable. Electricity prices generally don't fluctuate quite as much as gasoline prices do. And you don't need things such as oil changes, so you save money that way as well. But some of the barriers is that the cost to purchasing an EV like from the beginning is more expensive. So that is something that we need to take into consideration. There's also the issue of charging locations. We need to expand on charging infrastructure across the board and in certain areas like multi-unit dwellings and apartment buildings so that each individual has access to charge their vehicle. There are other accessibility barriers as well, such as language barriers, access to funding, and social awareness barriers that we need to address through education and outreach in certain communities. And if we missed anything, feel free to type in the chat. Oh, you're good, Drea. And one of the reasons why we're talking about this today is because different communities are impacted disproportionately. Studies done by the EPA, the American Lung Association, and others have found that these communities and individuals are greatly impacted by transportation emissions. So that would be our low income and low socioeconomic status communities, the Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, with Black communities facing the biggest risk, as well as elderly and children who feel these impacts greater than others. given all of that, we want to hear from you. What do you want to see EV development, or how do you want to see EV development incorporate equity? This is an opportunity for you to either use that raise hand function, or you can certainly type in your ideas in the chat. But we kind of want to hear from you with this, and as well as any of our panelists, if they want to jump in and say something that they think would be most beneficial. Otherwise, like I said, just mention it in the chat. But just to get you thinking about it, one example idea that I have touched on is increasing the number of charging stations. So if at the apartment building that you live in, or at whatever area that you're that you park your vehicle, if you have access to charging, we can decrease your barrier of purchasing one. And it looks like Aaron Fodge has something to say. Drea, can you unmute him?
Yep. Aaron, you can talk now.
Thanks. Hey, just I had one more. I just had one point about our premise about electric vehicles. I mean, there are some gasoline-powered vehicles that are really expensive too. So I think the assumption. I think we should be careful about the assumption we're making when we say that EVs are more expensive, so therefore they're less equitable than a gasoline-powered vehicle. I mean, I guess if you're buying a used gasoline-powered vehicle, you are potentially buying a vehicle that's cheaper upfront than an electric vehicle. But I would say it's just as inequitable. Most automobiles are just as inequitable as EVs when it comes to their purchase price.
Yeah, I think there are definitely ways that we can make it more equitable too. There are some issues and some vehicles that are similar, like certain Nissans, I guess. If you compare a Nissan sedan with the Nissan Leaf, generally the Leaf, depending on what kind, I guess, could be a little bit more expensive due to the battery and everything else. But I think that's a good point. I think we need to not discount EVs or make it seem like they're unobtainable when we can help folks get an EV in their garage or in their life. So
And I would just add, like, I mean, is it equitable that someone's able to buy a cheaper gasoline-powered vehicle up front, knowing that they're going to take on the burden of vehicular maintenance over the life of that vehicle? So I just want to make sure that when we're couching this discussion, that EVs aren't inequitable, driving's inequitable, and
yeah.
EVs just fall into that. And I think we're trying to make the case that they actually are more equitable because of the life cycle costs if we can get them into the hands of the people that truly need them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure.
And I think a lot of that goes back to some of the stigmas around EVs. Just that, when people think of electric vehicles, I think they tend to just think of Teslas. And that's, there's a certain class that goes along, or a certain status that goes along with Teslas, I think. And I think if we can start breaking down those barriers, then, or the stigmas, then it will become more accessible and more attainable and more feasible in people's mind, in everybody's minds, to have EVs and to make them more equitable and bring them to more communities.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to put that out there because I've been in enough meetings now where I feel like EVs take this big hit.
Right.
They're the inequitable mode of transportation, yet no one wants to take a shot at a gasoline powered vehicle that someone's going to have to pay for maintenance, insurance,
Right.
and everything else. And if they buy a used vehicle that may have a shortened life cycle, then they're just paying again what they could have put into an EV, right? So I think when we're coming up with ideas, it's trying to figure out how can we reduce that upfront cost
Right. That's exactly.
and maybe spreading it out over the life of the vehicle just so that it's affordable upfront.
I agree completely. I think that's super important as well. And hopefully, moving forward, that's something that we can work together on and, increase the funding opportunities for low income individuals so that they can purchase those vehicles. But I am going to be mindful of our time. And if you have more thoughts, please enter them into the chat. But Erin, that was a great point. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I'm going to transition now to highlight a couple Colorado EV plans that do incorporate equity. So first, there's the Colorado Electric Vehicle Plan. And this highlights four equitable actions, or four equity actions, I guess. But you'll see that the first action really sets up the following actions. So the first action is kind of like the baseline, and then the following three come from that first action. So the first action is that CEO will conduct an EV equity study to baseline, define, and map communities and EV registrations and accessibility, heavy duty and medium duty emission impacts, and criteria by which to evaluate and prioritize programming and outreach. So that's a major study that they're going to undertake, and will set them up for the second action, in which the Colorado Department of Transportation will integrate these recommendations from that study into its transit electrification grant programs by January of 2023. I am super excited to see what comes out of that. And then for the third action, this is more of a collaborative effort that will ensure that the heavy and medium duty vehicle electrification planning for these equity focused communities will be included in those strategies. So that's just kind of covering those types of vehicles. And then the fourth action says that the Colorado Energy Office will be involved in Public Utility Commission proceedings for their transportation electrician plans to really increase access for low income customers. And it's focused on the attainment of the Colorado Revised Statute Title 40. And I know that might look like jargon to some people, but I'll make sure to put this link into the chat that kind of breaks down those plans even further. So that's the Colorado Electric Vehicle Plan, but moving into a more localized plan, the City of Fort Collins has done a great job with their EV Readiness Roadmap. They hired a consulting firm who analyzed charging locations for low-income residents, as well as residents that live in multifamily dwellings in their EV Readiness Roadmap plan. And within that consulting firm actually determined that all of the public stations located in the demand areas would meet the needs of all community members. So they made sure to do that. They have also recently updated all of their public charging infrastructure and managed to keep the price to charge at a flat rate of $1 an hour. And they're trying to make that more affordable for the community. They also work to update the city code requiring multifamily unit dwelling developers to install EV conduits onto their residential properties. So that is like reflecting their wants to make it more accessible. So this will make it easier for those developers to put charging stations in those areas. And they also host an annual EV Group Buy program. They partner with utilities as well as us at Northern Colorado Clean Cities and dealerships in order to offer discounted EVs. But not only that, not only within their EV Readiness Roadmap, the City of Fort Collins is really a leader in this space. Their City Council recently updated the city's neighborhood and livability objective and social health objective to include specifically that they will be advancing equity, leading with race. They are also currently updating 3 of their city plans under the Our Climate Future process. And within that, they are engaging with the community, but they're listening and elevating the voices of historically underrepresented groups. If any of you in the group or any of the attendees are City of Fort Collins citizens, please let me know, because I can definitely connect you with folks that are putting that together so that you can use your voice in that process. As for Northern Colorado Clean Cities, we have a few steps that we are going to take to ensure that we are being equitable and advancing this discussion. We will continue to offer our free one-on-one advising sessions on EV development as well as other alternative fuels. We plan to enhance our efforts with multimodal transportation, as well as work with different apartment buildings and multi-unit dwelling property owners to increase EV charging stations at those locations. And we will continue to support the reductions of emissions and increases in our economic security through alternative fuel enhancements. And our executive director, Diego, actually has already started translating some of our documents into Spanish, which is awesome. But ultimately, this conversation is not going to go away. This is a topic that, you know, you don't just fix equity or you don't just reach equity and then it's over. This is an ever-changing and ever-moving process. So we plan to host more of these webinars in the future and really just get involved in our community. So if you have any questions or concerns or want to be involved in this after, please reach out to me. My email is below, but I'll make sure to include that in the thank you email as well, so you can reach me there. And then Drea, if you want to pull up the poll, see what our attendees think. So the question is, what Northern Colorado Clean Cities next steps regarding equity do you think will be the most impactful out of the ones that I have just listed? And if you think that there's something else that we could do that would pack a bigger punch, I guess, go ahead and type or click other and then go ahead and type it in the chat and we can see what people say. And we'll give you a couple minutes there, or a couple seconds, I guess.
So only 3 people have responded so far. So if you have any ideas, please share them with us. That'd be great.
It looks like we have 11 attendees. How many have responded now?
We have 6 responses so far.
All right, we'll just be mindful of time. Go ahead and let's see what people are saying. That's a little over half. Okay. Oh, and we have some others too. I'm interested to see what folks put in the chat. But the winner, or the most popular, I guess, would be enhanced effort with multimodal transportation, followed by increased EV charging at multi-unit dwellings and continue to support reductions of emissions. Great, thanks.
And in the chat, Erin suggested as an other zero interest loan program for EV purchases. So another good thing to look into.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, thanks everyone again. And there's my email. And we are going to switch it over. I would like to introduce Addison Phillips. Addison is a program manager on Colorado Energy Office's Transportation, Fuels, and Technology team. Addison manages the Charge Ahead Colorado EV Charger Grant Program, the Recharge EV Coaching Program, and supports CEO's transportation-related legislative efforts, as well as leads the effort to increase EV development in the Colorado state fleets. But he made time to come speak with us today, so thank you for that, Addison.
Yep, thank you, Amy. So as Amy already talked about, the Energy Office is currently undertaking or currently scoping a broad equity, EV equity study to baseline our efforts and kind of orient our kind of total efforts on the equity front. But I thought I would I put together a few slides here to kind of summarize the current equity efforts that we're undertaking, primarily through the Charge Ahead Colorado grant program. So working to essentially address the access to charging problem that was mentioned earlier for both urban and rural disadvantaged communities. So this slide just outlines some of the areas we're currently focusing on. So focusing on rural communities and corridors, especially along scenic byways. So those have an economic development benefit, as well as increasing EV charging access in underserved rural parts of the state. Another kind of specific subset of those are the DOLA Main Street communities, which I'll kind of go over in the next slide if you aren't aware of. But you have to be essentially a small rural community with a certain economic status to qualify for this program. And so we've been working through the Main Streets program with DOLA to increase charging access in those rural communities. And then also workplaces, obviously, and then as was mentioned, multi-family or multi-unit dwellings are a priority. In the most recent application round of Charge Ahead Colorado that just closed in June, we did award Grand Junction Housing Authority and then the senior housing, a new senior housing development in Durango. So those were really exciting applications to see. And if any of you have any connections or know anyone in the Northern Colorado area with connections to any kind of low income housing or housing authority developments, we certainly would love to see them apply for Charge Ahead in upcoming grant rounds. And the next grant round will be will run from October 1st until October 30th. So a couple of months of lead time if you do have someone that you have identified. Next slide, thank you. So just a kind of a quick point here on the Main Street program. So they offer these, it's a downtown revitalization program. There's an application process to qualify for the program, and then once you have become part of the program, it opens up various funding streams, various grant opportunities. So the third bullet point there is what's been most relevant to Charge Ahead Colorado. So DOLA has been offering mini grants to Main Street participant communities, and those DOLA mini grants qualify as match for the Charge Ahead Colorado grant program. So we pay for 80% of the station, and then the DOLA funds can then pay for the remaining 20% or some fraction of the 20%. And so if you happen to be connected to or are aware of any rural communities that may qualify for the Main Street program, I would encourage you to reach out to Andy Hill. She's my main contact there at DOLA. It's a somewhat long process to become a full member of the Main Street program, but there are a lot of long-term benefits, and we've had a couple of successful partnerships already through this program, which are on the next slide, actually. Thank you. So as I mentioned, so Main Street has been promoting Charge Ahead to these economic development opportunity rural communities. A lot of them have level 2 charging already, but we're really promoting and pushing for more level 3 all over the state, as well as in these Main Street communities. So the two Main Street communities that have received these mini grants so far as matching funds for Charge Ahead grants are Meeker and Lake City. Both of these are along scenic byways, which I also mentioned that we're targeting. They both received these mini grants as match, and they both did one of these charge points, 62.5 kilowatt fast charging stations. Both of those applications were led by their local electrical co-op, but then they also had buy-in from the city and local businesses. They were really great collaborative economic development projects, which had a lot of state funding come in to make possible. So just be sure to make any of your contacts aware of these, and kind of you can refer to the great success we've already seen with these two. So the Meeker station is on the Flat Tops Trail Scenic Byway, which runs from Meeker to Yampa, and there's also a fast charging station in process in Yampa, so that will electrify that entire Scenic Byway. And then Lake City is along the Silver Thread Scenic Byway, and Lake City just finished this. City of Creed is about to finish their charging station, and the city of Del Norte. So three really rural communities that will all have fast charging stations, and will really increase access there, and hopefully have an economic benefit for them as well in terms of electric vehicle tourism. Just a kind of a quick map here of the scenic byways. You may have seen this map before, but we've kind of been using this as a guide to identifying these communities where you have this intersection of economic development and increasing rural access to charging. And then it's just another specific photo. This is a photo directly from the ribbon cutting at the station in Meeker that I mentioned. And then, so this, yeah, I kind of already said this stuff, but yeah, the Flat Tops Trail Scenic Byway should be electrified by the end of October. That's the timeline for that station to be complete. Yeah, I think I've covered this already, so yeah, go ahead. And then last slide, just to kind of emphasize that this is more of a general point and less about the Charge Ahead Colorado program, but we've already talked about EV purchase price being somewhat of a barrier for certain demographics. But I think it's really important to remember that the benefits of EVs really are social benefits. So obviously climate change doesn't care about your demographic. It's going to impact everyone severely in the long run. Air quality impacts everyone. Lung health is a problem for everyone. And in fact, is more of a problem obviously for disadvantaged communities. And then one benefit that's often kind of not emphasized or not understood is that it will lower everyone's electricity costs. So utilities are capped in how much profit they can generate per year. And so as they sell more electricity, they can bring down the cost of their electricity for all of their customers, not just for electric vehicle drivers. So I think there are a lot of compelling social benefits to focus on when we're talking about electric vehicle adoption. And any questions I can take any questions now, or we can wait until the end. Doesn't matter.
Let's go ahead and save any questions right now for at the end. If you do have specific questions for Addison, go ahead and use that Q&A function. But I am going to turn it over now to Adrienne Dorsey. She is the Executive Director at Grid Alternatives and has over a decade of combined experience working in the fields of energy efficiency, solar energy, sustainability, and land conservation. Thank you for joining us, Adrienne. I'll let you get started.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. Good morning. As Amy mentioned, I work for Grid Alternatives. We're a national leader in making renewable energy technologies and job training accessible to low-income communities. We provide direct solar project development and installation. We also provide extensive workforce development and training programs, and also lead efforts to create and implement low-income policies designed to enhance access to renewable energy technologies for low-income and underserved communities. Next slide. Grid Alternatives' vision is a transition to clean, renewable energy that includes everyone. And that's really critical. Without everyone involved, we won't get to a point where we're really realizing a successful clean energy future. Next slide. So Grid Alternatives Colorado is the local affiliate of Grid Alternatives National. We serve the state of Colorado and have been in the state of Colorado for about 7 years now. So in that time, we've installed over 7.5 megawatts of solar, providing over 27 million of lifetime savings to low-income families, prevented 250,000 tons of emissions, and have trained over 3,000 volunteers on solar installation skills. Next slide. So over the past 3 years, Grid Alternatives has been developing our clean mobility work, primarily in California, which is where we're headquartered. We've been working with families to replace gasoline with sunshine by pairing electric vehicles with solar power, saving them money and replacing local air pollution with clean energy. So as a result, the communities we've worked with can produce their own transportation fuel and keep that money in the community while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions in their own neighborhoods. Grid is now using the expertise and lessons learned from our work in California to serve as a launching point for our work in Colorado. The slide here breaks down the clean mobility opportunity into what we see as really 3 core components, including access to electric vehicles, access to charging infrastructure, and access to fuel for the vehicle. All three of these components are critical, particularly in underserved communities where we can't just count on market forces to fill in the gaps. So grid is already providing the fuel aspect by building access to locally owned solar power. By incorporating the electric vehicle access and installing charging infrastructure, we can increase the value and impact of the solar power that we install every day. We've also been talking internally about the excitement around the fact that this is really the first time in about 100 years that we've had an alternative to gasoline. Yeah, looking forward to kind of what continues to evolve in the future. Next slide. In 2018, GRID worked with a group of UC Berkeley students to do a research project to determine a relatively simple fact. How much do low-income communities spend on gasoline? And what they found was that low-income communities spend about $100 billion annually. So also according to the Pew Charitable Trust, low-income households spend about 16% of their income on transportation. And I do want to caveat that I think that might have been that data might be a little bit outdated now. I think it may actually be a slightly higher percentage of their income. I believe that 16% was based on 2014 data, which is shown on this slide here. But that 16% that they found, based on 2014 data, was essentially double that of upper income families. So low income families are spending a tremendous amount of household income on gasoline costs. And not only that, gasoline is also the dirtiest fuel source that's out there. So if we can create systems where cars can run on clean electricity, either from solar on a customer's roof or the increasing amount of clean energy on the grid, greenhouse gas emissions from operating vehicles can fall to zero. Next slide. So I've linked a video here, and what you'll see, the entire video is in Spanish. It has subtitles. And the intent of the video is to provide a visual example of the work that GRID is doing to help pair electric vehicles with solar power. The individual that's kind of spotlighted in the video, his name is Efren, and he's from Mexico and currently lives in Fresno, California. So as I mentioned, the video will showcase the work that GRID is doing and also highlight the importance of developing programs in multiple languages to ensure that there's equitable access to all.
¿Qué tal? Mi nombre es Efraín Anguiano, vivo en la ciudad de Winton. Conocí esta organización sin fines de lucro que es fantástica. Me contactaron unas personas de Fresno y me quedé sorprendido cuando me propusieron instalar en mi casa paneles solares. Yo jamás pensé que yo pudiera tener algo así, debido a que he sabido que es un sistema bastante costoso. También por medio de esta organización pusieron un cargador en mi casa para un carro que yo ya tenía hace como un año. Un carro que solamente usa electricidad. Mi opinión acerca del carro es bastante positiva. Estoy muy contento desde que yo supe que iba a tener un carro tal vez un poco limitado en cuanto a horas de manejo independiente. Yo sabía, mi propósito era tener un carro local para mandados locales, como los niños a la escuela, como a la tienda, a las tiendas locales. Nací en México, en el estado de Michoacán. Desde niño me tocó mirar cómo las olas del mar nos traían plásticos que sabrá Dios de dónde habrán salido. Y yo estaba pequeño, pero yo todavía miraba que algo no andaba bien con eso, que en un futuro eso iba a ser muy malo para el planeta. Yo veo un futuro donde solamente ciertos vehículos, ciertos transportes, ciertas maquinarias usarán los hidrocarburos. Veo un futuro donde la mayoría de personas tendrá sus carros que van a estar mejorados, rindiendo muchas millas, dando muchas millas por cada carga que se les haga. Yo miro un buen futuro respecto a lo que un buen futuro venidero porque veo cómo la tecnología está avanzando de una manera fantástica.
Great. Thanks. So in the next slide, in addition to installing solar and really kind of connecting all the components together, Grid has also been working to develop programming with partners in a collaborative approach to develop and implement programs designed for low-income consumers. So the examples of the programs we've supported include the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project, and the Clean Cars for All program, which are all California programs. Some of the core principles that we've found as part of developing these programs to consider for future program development include that the actual voices and transportation needs of underserved communities should be made central to these conversations. Funding for outreach in disadvantaged communities is especially critical, especially as we talked about earlier, that there is a commonly held stereotype that electric vehicles are only for certain kinds of people. I think that's changing, but it still exists and something that needs to be broken down as we're expanding the interest and use of electric vehicles. And also, equity programs should be closely coordinated to provide comprehensive solutions that address all of the components, including the vehicle, the charging infrastructure, and the fuel. Next slide. So what we've seen is that about 80% of charging happens at home. And so we've seen multifamily affordable housing complexes as a really critical market to unlock low-income EV adoption. But there's still challenges kind of wrestling with the barriers of chicken and egg. Do you install the EV infrastructure first? Do you provide incentives for people to buy the vehicles? How does payment work? Who owns the system? So there's a lot still to be figured out. And it was encouraging to Addison to hear some more about the work that the CEO is doing, and that there's funding programs out there to help kind of address and work through these challenges. So Grid has been working on a number of pilots over the past couple of years, again, primarily in California, to integrate EV infrastructure into multifamily buildings. Key to our pilots has been developing deep partnerships that bring together a variety of partners, including utilities, local governments, and affordable housing partners. So the two kind of simple takeaways that we've seen from the work that we've done with the pilot programs is that partnerships are critical and that figuring out effective multifamily charging is challenging. Next slide. So some additional low-income strategies and lessons learned from the transportation electrification equity programs that we've done to date include that proactive coordination between vehicle infrastructure programs is critical for unlocking low-income EV adoption. Also, trust is critical, especially when we're working with low-income, marginalized communities that maybe the technology and the financial investments may be new or unfamiliar. And so it's really critical to develop that trust and engage trusted partners as we're developing, implementing, and developing outreach to engage those communities in the uptick of EV infrastructure and EV vehicles. And then finally, it's important to ensure a diverse mix of individuals, especially those from communities of color, marginalized communities, and disproportionately impacted communities, are involved to help inform decision-making and ensure that the programs are inclusive and equitable. Next slide. So this slide here lists my contact information and also our Chief Strategy Officer. Again, he's based out of the Bay Area, but he's been leading all of our clean mobility work. So I feel free to reach out to myself or him if you have questions. And then also please visit our website. We do have a clean mobility page on our website that talks some more about the programs that we've worked with and the work that we've done. So it has additional resources if you're interested. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. That was really great. And I agree. I just put it in the chat too, but trust and like meeting people where they're at is so critical. We are going to go ahead and move to Matt Fromer, who joined Southwest Energy Efficiency Project known as SWEEP in 2018 as the Transportation Program Senior Associate, where he focuses on electric vehicle and clean transportation policy and advocacy. So take it away, Matt. And again, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function and we will try to address those at the end.
All right. Thank you, Amy. Great presentation so far from Addison and Adrienne as well. So I have a lot of slides here. I'll try not to be too repetitive. I'll try to just cruise through here so we have some time for Q&A at the end. But basically just to frame the conversation a little bit, electric transportation is critical to achieving Colorado's ambitious climate goals. You can see that pie chart on the left there. Transportation is now the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in Colorado. And on the graph on the right there shows where we are with current policies in that bar chart, sort of on the left side there. You could see, between 2015 and 2030, with current policies, we're going to see deep reductions in the electricity sector, specifically with that 80% renewable energy target from Xcel and other utilities as well. We're really not doing enough on the other sectors of the economy, transportation, buildings, industry, that we need to reduce emissions 50% by 2030. And these are some graphs from the Energy Office. They put together a GHG roadmap to look at pathways to carbon reduction. So that's kind of like tease up future policies on climate. Colorado, yeah, I think Addison mentioned this, but we have a goal of 940,000 EVs on the road by 2030, almost 1 million. And today we have about 28,000. So a long way to go in the next 10 years. And we really need the supportive policies to get us there. You go to the next slide. And then at the same time, we have this transportation equity problem where lower income households spend a disproportionate amount of their income on transportation costs. And you can see that these blue bars are broken up by quintiles of household income. And you can see on the left there is the lowest income quintile. They spend about 1/3 of their household income on transportation expenses. Whereas on the right side of the graph, we have the highest income quintile. They spend about 9% of their income on transportation expenses. Low-income communities, just a couple things there. Wanted to mention that lower-income households, on average, their vehicles are about 15% less fuel efficient than high-income households, which results in higher fuel costs. And those cars since they're older, they tend to break down more frequently, which adds maintenance costs and can put their employment at risk if they're dependent on that car to get to work. So basically just to say that these lower income households have the most to benefit from replacing their gasoline vehicle with an EV. Go to the next slide. So the big question, how can we solve climate change and economic and social inequalities at the same time? It's easy? No, it's not easy at all. This is one of those like wicked problems. So if anyone has any ideas, feel free to share. It's something we talk about all the time, but it is really challenging. So I'm going to talk about some of the state policies, what local governments are doing, and then what the utilities are doing. Extending the benefits of EVs to low-income and disadvantaged communities. And we're talking about EVs. We're including all these vehicles on the right here. So like freight vehicles, delivery, transit buses, school buses. We have personally owned vehicles like Teslas. That's the Rivian electric pickup truck. At the bottom in the middle there, it's coming out next year. And then I would also include electric micromobility like electric bikes and electric scooters. So including all of those different vehicles in the conversation based on those communities' needs. Next slide. So expanding EV ownership. This is a graph from Pacific Gas and Electric out in California, comparing the total cost of ownership over 10 years of a Hyundai Kona electric to a Hyundai Kona gas vehicle with all-wheel drive. So you can see even this, and this includes the purchase incentive for the federal and the state purchase incentive. You can see the green bar, the electric's about $5,000 more expensive up front, but then over time, you save money on fuel and maintenance. So it's really overcoming that first hurdle, the upfront cost of the EV, and offsetting that with purchase incentives, with financing programs, which we'll talk a little bit about. Next slide. I do want to point out that there are a good number of like early model Nissan Leafs on the used car market, and they're very affordable. So less than 10,000. Now this is from Carvana, and there were like dozens of Nissan Leafs up there. I think these have like an 80 to 100 mile range. So good for getting around town. Again, they're going to be low cost. And this used EV market is just going to continue growing. You know, this is typical of any new technology where in the beginning it's expensive. Typically, you know, wealthier households are able to afford it. Where this happened with solar, it happened with iPhones, happened with you know, energy efficient air conditioners and appliances. It's happening with electric vehicles as well. But yeah, you know, what can we do in the policy realm to kind of increase access for low-income individuals to this cleaner and more and lower cost technology? Next slide. So I like this map from Denver. It's their equity map. That's what the colors represent. So it's like kind of a combination of health, environmental, and economic characteristics of neighborhoods in Denver. And the blue is less inequity. It's kind of a double negative, but these neighborhoods are better off. And then the red is more inequity. And you can see those black dots are where the public charging stations are, and they're fairly concentrated in the blue areas. So Denver's made it one of their goals in their EV action plan, which they released earlier this year, to install public charging stations in those orange and those red areas to give people better access to charging. Next slide. Do want to touch on one of the biggest things happening in Colorado this year on transportation electrification, which is Xcel Energy's Transportation Electrification Plan, or TEP. And I think both Aaron and Amy mentioned Senate Bill 77, which requires the regulated utilities to invest in electric vehicles. So this plan hasn't been approved yet, but the proposal is about $102 million over 3 years in transportation electrification. And I'm just going to go through some of like the low-income programs. They're proposing that 15% of the total budget be spent in low-income communities, and that would include things like community mobility and charging hubs, electric mobility services, so beyond personal vehicle ownership, we're talking about electrifying car share and ride share, electric bikes and scooters, electric transit buses and school buses to lower those emissions, particularly you know, local air pollutants in urban areas. And then a large part of the budget is rebates for EV charging stations, and those rebates are higher in low-income areas for single-family residential, multifamily, fleet and workplace charging. They've got advisory services for businesses and local governments who want to electrify their fleets. And in general, this is a good way to sort of stimulate the economy right now during the COVID-19 pandemic and create clean jobs here. You know, utilities have a built-in cost recovery mechanism over a longer period of time, so they can make these investments now in shovel-ready projects and put people to work. And then two programs that I really like on the right there's the Ego electric car share. It's a company operating in Denver and Boulder, and they have, I think, a Bolt and a Volt in their fleet. The goal to go toward 100% electric. And then on the bottom, so the state is offering the electric school bus grants through the Alt Fuels Colorado program. And the last round, 5 different school districts applied for the funding. So we're going to see some new electric school bus pilots over the next year in Colorado, which is exciting. Next slide. This is just another overview of the Xcel TEP. So those are the 5 portfolios. residential, multi-unit dwelling, commercial advisory services, and then kind of a catch-all research, innovation, and partnerships. And you could see there how they're prioritizing low-income customer programs with the 16 million spent across the 5 portfolios. So yeah, they're expecting the $102 million will build about 20,000 new charging ports in their service territory by 2023, which is great, about double the current number. And about almost 800 of those will be in low-income communities. Go to the next slide. So yeah, I did want to mention this concept of like 2 types of savings from transportation electrification. There's savings for EV drivers, and that's through the lower fuel and maintenance costs of EVs compared to gasoline cars. And then there's this idea that if we electrify all the vehicles, like the 5 million cars in Colorado, that there will be these enormous grid benefits where we'll increase grid efficiency by plugging in the vehicles at night. And basically, this allows the utility to collect more in revenue than they're spending to build out the charging infrastructure. And that additional profit then sort of trickles down to their ratepayers in the form of lower rates. This is something we've seen play out in California, where they've had utility EV programs for 8 or 9 years now. The next slide. Yeah, so this is the virtuous cycle of utility EV investments. And what part of the Xcel TEP, they did a cost benefit analysis and found that for every $1 spent on EV charging infrastructure from the utility, Xcel will collect $3 in additional revenue from electricity sales to EV drivers. And those are the cost savings that are passed down to ratepayers. And the next slide. So these are just some other ideas, and Adrienne talked a bit about California. They have cap and trade, a low carbon fuel standard, so a lot of money for climate programs, and they've carved out a good portion of that specifically for disadvantaged and low income communities. Like the map at the bottom right there is the Cal Enviro screen tool, and the red areas are that's kind of their equity map, where they areas where they have lower health outcomes, the economic and environmental inequalities. So they're focusing, I think it's 10% of cap and trade money in those areas. So a couple ideas out there. First is to complete a community needs assessment. Adrienne touched on that. We want to hear from these communities. For some people, maybe an electric bike is a better option than an electric vehicle, and it's much more affordable for them to match. And then an EV Cash for Clunkers program. This is something that Senator Chuck Schumer proposed, and I think Biden has kicked around the idea of providing rebates for low-income households to trade in their high-polluting gasoline vehicles for an electric vehicle or an e-bike rebate. A low-income electric bike incentive and subsidies for electric bike share. I think the Energy Office in Denver exploring some programs around this now. And then electrifying rideshare, car share, and food delivery services. And also want to touch on the lower income financing assistance. Some cool programs out there, partnerships with utilities. Basically, they can act as banks to lock in lower interest rates for people who have really poor credit scores. Maybe where I might have to pay, say, 6% interest on the purchase of a new EV, someone with a low credit score would pay 25%. Just proves that it's expensive to be poor. So anything we could do around that, innovative financing tools and green banking to help people buy these vehicles. And I think that's all I've got.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. So we don't have a ton of time left, but just some things for all of our attendees and panelists, I suppose, to consider in the next few months. We want to leave you with 3 action items to take away from today's webinar. So firstly, we want you to consider speaking with your colleagues, employees, friends, family, and community members about equity in general, and specifically as it relates to transportation and the EV space. So what is their understanding of equity? What did they see as barriers and benefits of EVs as it relates to equity? And then what do they see as some solutions? Maybe you can set up a similar brainstorming session with some of them. And then that kind of leads into our second action item, which is to consider making a pledge to integrate equity into your organization or your business or company or whatever you're involved with. So think of short-term and long-term plans and goals, as well as everyday operations, best practices that can better integrate equity into everything that you do. And then lastly, we want to ask our attendees to come to our next equity webinar and share the conversations you've had, the goals and best practices you've set, and then some things you've learned along the way. Equity Part 2 will be coming sometime in September, so stay tuned to all of the NCCC updates, and we hope to see you at those as well. If you have any thoughts or ideas right now about any goals your organization might have toward equity, please feel free to share them in the chat or raise your hand. We'll get in as many as we can in these last few minutes.
Any questions, Drea?
Yeah, there were a few. It looks like maybe some of them have been answered in the Q&A, but let's try to answer this one. Would a state tax on gas that starts raising money for helping low-income community members purchase EVs be feasible? The help could be in the form of grants, down payment assistance, interest payment, etc. And interested persons can apply for a lottery to receive this aid. Does anyone have any thoughts or ideas on that? That was kind of a long question. I can read it again if you want.
If this pertains to like any types of taxes, usually I like to see taxes that are progressive. So necessarily a tax on just gas in general might be seen as a regressive tax because it's just on everybody. So certain taxes maybe on certain other products or other things might also be, looked at. But it does seem like a gas tax could be feasible.
Yeah, that's a great point, Diego, especially with some of the stats we talked about earlier and how low-income communities or low-income households necessarily spend more on gas and vehicle maintenance and transportation in general. So yeah, some sort of more progressive tax might be a better option, but yeah, always like to see tax revenue going back into communities. So it's a great idea.
Matt, did you have something to add?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a cool idea. I mean, first off, it's incredibly difficult to raise the gas tax in Colorado or any taxes because of Tabor, which is why we have really high vehicle registration fees and other fees. We also have like a $9 billion transportation budget shortfall for that reason. So there is an effort to raise the gas tax or sort of look into other innovative solutions to maybe take some more money out of the general fund to fund transportation. I would also say like some good news about the current administration, the Polis administration, is that CDOT is very open to investing transportation dollars in electrification, which has not been the case in the past. So, I think they requested 9 or 10 million of the annual budget this year for electric buses and other EV support. That's new for CDOT. Typically, they spend a lot of money on highway expansion, and that just, as we know, induces more traffic and more pollution. So I think that they're starting to head in a better direction. And we need to, I agree, we need to raise the gas tax, raise more money for this, but also change the way we spend the money and shift those dollars toward, cleaner transportation options, transit and biking, and also electrification.
Absolutely. I do want to be mindful of time because it's just over 11, but if anybody has any other questions, there will be a post-webinar survey. You can ask them there. You can also email any of our panelists here. We're happy to engage with you further, but thank you all so much for coming to this webinar, and thank you to our wonderful panelists today as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for organizing, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great afternoon.
Bye.